Welcome to Common Space, a conversation between three friends who happen to be United Methodist pastors. My name is Chris Estes.
Hey, Chris.
I'm Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Ryan. I'm Daryl.
Daryl, welcome, guys. So glad to see you. This week we're going to talk about a story from early on in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it's chapter 11 in Genesis, and it's the story of the Tower of Babel. It's where everybody speaks the same language in this story, and they decide to build a tower that reaches to the heavens, not because they want to get closer to God, but to make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered. God sees it and says, if they can pull this off, nothing will be impossible for them. Then comes the twist. God confuses their language. They can't understand each other, and the whole project collapses. They get scattered anyway. The place is called Babel, which sounds like confused. Daryl, how'd you learn about this story? What was the interpretation that you first heard?
Yeah, like a lot of stories that get presented in the church, it kind of gets flattened into a two-dimensional story of like your personal faith or your personal struggle with sin. In this case, it's a personal struggle with pride, all right? Like I was kind of taught this story as if you're prideful like Nimrod and you have pride that thinks you can get everybody to build a tower to make a name for yourself, then God's going to come against your pride and thwart that somehow, as is done in this story. The problem with that interpretation, though, is it didn't really seem to do much for me as I grew up in a world full of towers that don't seem to be knocked down by God, and a world full of pride that also seems to go unchecked, including my own. So that interpretation really didn't do much for me.
Ryan, I've got a question for you.
Uh-huh.
What do we know, or what can we guess about when this story was written and who might have written it? What was happening in the world at the time, and what might make this story feel important to them?
Well, as we've talked about with a few of these Genesis narratives, these narratives were kind of put together at a time when the Jewish people were in exile, and they were in a place called Babylon. And a lot of these Genesis stories had counterpart stories from the Babylonian culture, most of them much older than these Genesis stories. And that's a similar thing to what's happening here. While the people are in exile, there is an ancient Babylonian story about another tower. And so kind of in that other story, we'll tell the story. You'll already see some similarities between the stories, but I think telling the story that the Babylonians told will help us set up a little bit of this. But so in this other story, there's this king named Enns, and he's a king of one of the greatest cities in the world. And he decides that he wants to unify the world in his city. He wants to build this huge temple to his God, and he needs the resources in order to build it. And those resources would be, obviously the bricks and the logs and the things like that, but also the slaves. And so Enmerkar sees this neighboring kingdom, Arata, and sends a messenger to Arata and says, hey guys, I'd like you to be my slaves and to bring all of your resources to my city and build this tower, so that we can all get together and worship one God as one people and all speak the same language. And ultimately, it's kind of an exercise in diplomacy almost, because it's just a lot of messengers going back and forth between Arata and Enmerkar. And by the end of it, Arata decides to do it. They decide to subject themselves to somebody else, and they start coming to build this tower.
So to be clear, we have an ancient Near Eastern story that predates the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. And in that story, one people group dominates another people group to build a tower to a god. And that god has the power to unite or disrupt the language people speak.
Yeah, isn't that weird that there's so many different similarities here?
Is there any significance to the word Babel or the nation of Babylon?
Well, yeah, obviously, yeah. I think that's a big connection, is Babel and Babylon, the place where the Hebrew people are when they decide to record this story. I mean, we know that the story of Enmerkar is from at least about 2500 BC. We know that this story was compiled and put in the form that we have it now in about the 5th century BC. So the Enmerkar story was told about 2,000 years before that. What we don't know is really when the Hebrew people first started telling the Babel story themselves. and the Tower of Babel. And there are different scholars that kind of argue whether or not the Tower of Babel story that we know in Genesis actually came from this more ancient story from Enmerkar. And yeah, they all have to do with languages. It's all really interesting.
So why did they tell the story?
To answer good questions. So you can all imagine like a child coming up to you and asking a question like, hey, why is those people's language different than our language? And in this culture, when questions like that were asked, they decided to come up with stories stories for it. It's called an etiological story, and it gives an explanation for the way that the world is. The strange thing about our story that we're discussing today is that if you go back to chapter 10, which is where that Nimrod character comes in, Nimrod is introduced in chapter 10, verse 8. But if you go through chapter 10, what you're seeing is that people are scattering. They are moving out, and it says over and over again that they went to their land, they spoke their own language, they went with their own families, and they became their own nations. And so in chapter 10, there's already kind of this scattering, and there's already multiple languages. But then in chapter 11, we kind of come back and it says all the people were one, and they were speaking one language. It's kind of a strange thing, but it gives you a cue that perhaps we're not dealing directly with history here, since we've already started talking about the fact that people had their own languages.
Is there any significance to the name Nimrod? Does that have a meaning?
Yeah, the Hebrew word, the root of that name, Nimrod, is rebel. So this is an archetype, right? This story, this character that is at the heart of this story in the Bible. It's not just the name that Mo called Larry and Curly. And if you don't know who Mo, Larry, and Curly are, I invite you to stop this podcast right now and get thyself to the Three Stooges. There's much more deep theology there than you will find here. But yeah, Nimrod means rebel.
So Nimrod isn't actually mentioned in the story about the tower. So Nimrod, though, in chapter 10, he's named as the person that essentially founded Babel. And so that's kind of what the origin of the city of Babylon, Babel is.
All right, guys, either one of you. The story specifically mentions bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
Instead of stone. What kind of leap was that back then? Would that have represented something to ancient people? Power, progress, a threat?
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these stories that we find in the Bible are actually stories about technology. And so bricks and mortar is a technology that was used in order to be able to build bigger. And it's an important part of the story. And if you are the kingdom, if you're the empire that has a certain piece of technology, and you're surrounded by kingdoms that do not have that certain piece of technology, that's significant for what you're able to do. There's other stories a little bit later when they start talking about bronze weapons versus iron weapons. And that is a very big, significant difference, because bronze weapons were not very durable. And so if you were a nation that had iron weapons, you could dominate a bronze society.
I think that's a very important point to bring up as how we get this story. As Ryan has painted this picture for us in terms of history and context of the exile in Babylon. Imagine this people group, these Hebrew people who have been exiled to this fantastic kingdom that has all this technology that they don't have. And they're hearing a story from that kingdom about Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata. And then that story gets retold in a way that reframes how we hold empire and empire's wonderful technology, and how they may be able to build towers bigger than we can build. And they may have technologies and weapons that we don't have, which is terrifying, as Ryan points out. So the story takes on a whole different meaning other than if you have pride, God will confuse your language.
Might be important at this point for our listeners to maybe lay out the timeline here a little bit. My first reading of the Bible, or my first hearing of it, would be, oh, well, Genesis is the first book, and these first 11 chapters come after the beginning of creation, and so this must have happened a long, 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 long time ago. They must have written this story down a long, long time ago, thousands of years ago. But really, the story is written down at a much later time. In fact, the book of Genesis is compiled at a much later time. Ryan, you want to expand on that any?
Yeah, it's like I was just saying a little while ago, is that, the stories that are in Genesis and the stories that are in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're stories that are older than the Babylonian exile, but they weren't really compiled and put together in the form that we find them until that Babylonian exile. And so that Babylonian exile started in 586 BC. And when the people realized that they were no longer going to have a home and they no longer had a temple, they had to figure out how they were going to maintain some sort of national and religious identity. And the way that they did that was by codifying the stories that they'd been telling already for years. And so, like I said, we don't know exactly how old the Tower of Babel story is itself, but we know that the form that it's in now came from the 6th century BC.
I think it might be helpful because of some of these stories that we've already hit in Genesis, because we're kind of crawling our way through Genesis right now. And it's helpful to see the larger storytelling arc, that it's at least possible to see that, Genesis 1 and 2 offer a couple different poems and stories that approach the idea of creation and how did this all come to be and why. And then things really start to go south. And from Genesis 3 3 through Genesis 11, things are getting more and more out of control. You have Cain and Abel, you have the flood, you have what Noah does after the flood when he plants a vineyard and waits for the grapes to get wasted. You have this story of the tower, and all that's bringing you to Genesis 12, where we're going to meet Abraham and Sarah, and a new thing is going to be started. And so it can be helpful just to see Tower of Babel in that context as part of everything spinning out of control as people self-differentiate, begin to see themselves as source rather than God as source. But it also might help us there's a way to look at Genesis as the prequel to the Exodus. It's kind of Star Wars 1, 2, and 3, and Exodus is Star Wars 4, A New Hope. The Exodus is the first story. It's the primary story. It's the story upon which all the other stories are built. And there's very good scholarship that points to the idea of seeing Genesis as a bunch of little exoduses that are leading you, that are pointing you, foreshadowing this story. And this is a perfect example of a little mini exodus where empire kind of rises up and flexes its muscles. And when empire does that, people get oppressed, people get screwed over, people get subjugated and killed and enslaved. And so that's what's happening kind of between the lines of this story. Is it's a little exodus with a little Pharaoh and a little group that needs to be delivered from that.
It's a story of what happens when powerful people get new technology, and it's told as a warning or maybe a critique of empire.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the more helpful interpretations that I have been given for this story, as opposed to don't be prideful, which again, it's not a bad idea to not be prideful, but it's just not enough for this story. But what I have been taught is that because we can is not always a good reason to do something. And that new technology is something that tends to tempt us to run out. There's this tension between our technology and our implementation of that technology. And usually someone gets screwed. The new thing comes on the scene, whether it's the bricks and mortar or nuclear weapons or social media, and we race it out, we deploy, we unleash because we can. And then as the bodies begin to pile up in the rearview mirror, we start to wonder if we should have, or at least if we should have done things differently.
And then where's God in the middle of that, or at the end of the day, I'm asking?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah.
No, I think that's not a question that needs answering. I think that's the question that this story and many other stories like it in Genesis and the Exodus confront us with. It is the mirror that gets held up to our face.
My answer to that, my own question, would be God is there. God is there, and God is luring us with love to love, even in the midst of our tragic crashes and falls.
Chris, that sounds like something that might be connected to some big book wisdom.
Or recovery in general, yeah. This is step one for sure. We build our towers, our careers, our images, our relationships, and trying to manage our own life on our own terms, and it eventually crashes. But the crash is also mercy. Our big book, the basic text of 12 Steps, says selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Tower of Babel looks to me like untreated ego.
Ooh, so pride does play a part.
Yeah, I think so. But the scattering is mercy, actually. It's an invitation to surrender. That's God's mercy there. He's luring us with love to surrender, connect, stop building monuments and start building community. That'd be a 12-step way to look at it, I believe.
I love that.
So maybe there is a pride aspect to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it says they decided that they wanted to do this just to build a name for themselves. Let's make a name for ourselves so that we don't get scattered. I mean, their whole thing is that they're trying to avoid that scattering, that blessing. And one of the questions I think that I get about this story the most often is, why was God threatened by this whole thing to begin with? Why is a tower threatening to this God? Why the God character in the story comes out and says, look, they're one people. They all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they don't understand one another, which that understand is Shema, by the way, so that they don't listen to each other. And, the big question here is, why is this God that we often portray as omnipotent threatened by this situation at all? I think what we've done is kind of started reading it a little bit strangely when we think that God is threatened by this situation. This story is easy to use in such a way that you could say something like, God created the separation between these people, and we have to maintain that separation.
Let me take a stab at it here. God's not against building towers. God's not about stifling human creativity. Rather, what he's about is encouraging us to not forget our humanity on one side. And also, if power gets concentrated too much in one direction, it's going to crush others.
Yeah, this story says that when you feel the boot of empire pressing down on your neck, even when they have the technology and you don't, this God is with you, working, pulling the whole system back toward justice and right relationship.
Yeah. Ironically, as I was saying, this story can be used to start enforcing some of our worst ideas about the story. And in South Africa, there was an example. It was actually documented by the Dutch Reformed Church that the Tower of Babel story is something that God did and scattered us. And so we have to enforce that separation. And so the Tower of Babel story was officially used as a defense of apartheid. And so the horrors of apartheid in South Africa came from a biblical basis, at least some parts of it. Again, the threat here isn't really that the people were one, but the threat was that there was somebody in power enforcing that oneative. This coercive uniformity is the threat, is the thing that's going against the desire that God has for the world that God's created. And from the beginning of that story, the world is created in a beautiful story of diversity. We read the creation narratives and we see so many different things being created. And then when God creates the human beings, God tells the human beings, go and take care of all of this. Scatter throughout the earth, multiply, subdue the earth, and take care of everything that I've created. And what the story says is that the people, instead of scattering, instead of going and doing the thing that God wanted them to do, decided to make a name for themselves, stay in one place, become uniform, and try to just stack their power up in one spot. But then like you said, sometimes the scattering is a blessing. We end up thinking and reading this story as if God separating the people and changing their languages was a curse. But there's often a play in the Hebrew Bible between blessings and curses, wonders and plagues. You can interpret those words in two different ways that sound different depending on where you're sitting. And this is a blessing in the fact that the people then, once again, have to start scattering. And they have to start fulfilling this mission that God has for humanity and spreading over the earth and taking care of the things that God has given them to take care of.
So an arc of the first part of Genesis could be, it starts with in a garden. It starts with a creation, actually, where God says good. Creation of humanity, which God says very good. Then before you know it, we've got brother killing brother. And then we've got people tribing up into empire.
Yeah, and this is where the mirror part comes in, because as Ryan just told us about this story being used to justify apartheid, and we're not trying to single out the Dutch Reformed Church or the people of South Africa.
No.
Like they're guilty of something that we're not guilty of. That's not the point. It's also not the point of the story of this Bible, but just sit in the tragic irony for a moment of our spiritual ancestors recording these stories for us, for future generations, because of their struggle with empire and narcissism and pride and thinking that self is source and not God is source, of thinking of other tribes as dangerous or something to be afraid of. They're wrestling with that. They're failing, and they record their failures for us. And then we take their failures and interpret them in ways so we can fail the same fail. We can do the same thing. Like, they're not worse than us. They're not dumber than us. They are us. This is a mirror for us to ask the question, where am I doing this in my life? Where is this empire, this self as source, raging and enslaving and hurting and oppressing others in my life? And how can I be part of putting it back together?
That's the power of the biblical narrative, not so much to be a record of what happened, but to tell us it happens.
Oh, preach.
Instead of saying it happened, it's saying it happens.
Yeah, so Genesis is the story of the birth of the world, essentially. And it is kind of this way that we set up the birth of the Hebrew nation. It is what sets up the coming of Abraham. There's another parallel to this in the book of Acts, the birth of the church and the birth of the people that follow this Jesus. One of the ways that the scriptures are used and the authors of the scriptures wrote stories so often was to make us think about other stories when we're reading something later. And so the book of Acts, just as an arc, really kind of sets up well against Genesis and especially against this story. We read in the beginning of the book of Acts that Jesus says to the community of disciples, go now to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And we get 8 chapters into the book and they're all still huddled in the same spot. not scattering, not fulfilling the mission. They're still just panicking, praying in one room. And often, we do hear the sermons on Pentecost that Acts 2 is kind of this reversal of the Tower of Babel story, when all of the people gather together in Jerusalem and start speaking in tongues and they can all understand each other. And it is an amazing story. And it is absolutely got to do with the confusion of languages with the Babel story. But I think the great reversal of this is when Stephen is persecuted and the disciples realize, oh, we got to go. And they have to scatter once again, and they have to start speaking, and they have to start listening.
Yeah, I mean, in one account, the angel of the Lord even shows up and is like, bruh, remember when he said y'all got to go? What are y'all doing? You're still sitting here like you're supposed to go. Get up and go.
Maybe like the church, they were just hanging out wherever they were as a bless me club when it was time to go.
Ouch. Ouch, Chris. That hurt me a little bit.
Yeah. So was this whole Babel project a failure?
That's an interesting question, Chris. What do you think?
I think maybe it wasn't. It was a step one moment, a necessary crash, if you will. Because like the song says, there's no such thing as a pointless up and down. Even the collapse was part of the climb. Ego and empire would have crushed them later. Scattering prevented that. Maybe the point isn't to build higher, but to live deeper with humility in relationship. Does that make sense, Daryl?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I think anytime we read these stories in ways that bring us to, self-righteous resolution, we can trust that we've misread the story. So if we read Babel and say to other people, you better watch out for your pride or God's going to come get you, we missed it. But if we read this story and it makes us feel uncomfortable, but it also makes us see ourselves in the larger story where our spiritual ancestors have also struggled with empire and technology, and because we can, and first step crashes, then we're probably getting somewhere with it.
I guess we'll leave it there then. Guys, any book recommendations?
How about the Bible? I mean, we've kind of come through chapter 11 now, the beginning of chapter 11. So yeah, if you want to read something, read Genesis 1 through 11. There's a reason that it's at the very beginning of this giant library of books, and it sets an important arc out for us to understand as we read the rest of it. So yeah, read Genesis 1 through 11.
Yeah, we've said this one before. We'll just keep saying it because as Chris teaches us, repetition builds enlightenment. Genesis for Normal People, a guide to the most controversial, misunderstood, and abused book of the Bible by Pete Enns and Jared Byas.
Thanks for the recommendations, guys. I'd like to speak to the audience for a second. It's been great the last couple of weeks. Been receiving texts and emails from listeners encouraging us, as well as giving us ideas for future episodes. And please just keep them coming. It's funny sitting here in the room like we do and looking at Ryan on a screen and Daryl sitting next to me and Adam and Christian here in the room with us and just talking into this microphone. I get some reaction out of those guys, but we don't get any reaction out of the people that are listening to it as we're sitting here doing this, which is unusual. Normally, we're in front of people speaking and, if they're not asleep, we're getting some sort of reaction out of them. And so it's just great. Keep those cards and letters rolling in. We appreciate that much.
I do need to defend Christian's honor because one of our responses from one of our avid listeners came in last week, and Christian, our producer who edits the podcast, the listener thought that I had dropped an F-bomb in the previous episode. And I need to defend Christian's honor that he censors out all the F-bombs. No F-bombs are getting through, and that was simply a glitch, and I did not say what you thought I said.
No F-bombs are getting through, but that does not mean you're not lobbing them.
I didn't say I wasn't saying it. I just said Christian catches them all.
So until next time, everyone, as the song says, may your eyes be filled with wonders, your heart full of joy, and your footsteps firm as you walk with God. Bye-bye, everyone.
Peace.
Shalom, my friends.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Common Space. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to this show so you don't miss a single episode. If you have a faith-related question you'd like to submit to the show for the chance of it being featured on a future episode, visit ahumc.org/questions to submit. That's ahumc.org/QUESTIONS. If you'd like to contact the podcast team, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.